You already know the name. You have seen the movie. You know the ship hit an iceberg. You know it sank. You know people died. But here is the thing. Almost everything you think you know about that night is either incomplete or just plain wrong. The real story of the Titanic is not a love story. It is not just a disaster story either. It is a story about decisions. Bad ones. And the people who paid the price for them. By the end of this video you are going to look at Titanic in a completely different way. Not the Hollywood version. The real one. First let's talk about what the Titanic actually was. In 1912 this ship was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. It was 882 feet long. To give you an idea of how big that is, if you stood the Titanic on its end it would be taller than most skyscrapers today. It had a swimming pool, a gym, a Turkish bath, fine dining restaurants. It even had its own daily newspaper printed on board every morning. This was not just a ship. It was a floating city. The people who built it wanted it to be known for comfort rather than speed. They were not trying to break any records. They were trying to show the world that traveling across the ocean could feel like living in the finest hotel in Europe. And it worked. Some of the wealthiest people in the world were on board. Millionaires. Business owners. Politicians. But also, and this part gets forgotten, hundreds of regular people. Families who had saved up everything they had for a ticket. Immigrants who were leaving their entire lives behind and heading to America for a fresh start. Rich and poor. All on the same ship. And that detail matters a lot. We will come back to it. Now here is where the story gets uncomfortable. On the day the Titanic sank, the crew already knew there was ice ahead. Not a rumor. Not a guess. The ship received 7 separate ice warnings throughout that day. 7. From other ships that had already passed through that area and seen the ice with their own eyes. 7 warnings. And the Titanic kept going at almost full speed. The decision to continue at high speed despite those warnings was one of the biggest oversights of that entire night. Now to be fair, at that time, going fast through ice was considered normal. Captains did it all the time. The thinking was that a ship this big could handle it. And the weather that night was perfect. Calm water, clear sky, no waves. So nobody was panicking. But there was one problem nobody thought about. Calm water actually made things more dangerous. When there are waves, they crash against icebergs and create white foam at the base. That foam makes icebergs easier to spot at night. No waves means no foam. And no foam means an iceberg just sits there in the dark, almost invisible, until it is too late. At 11:40 at night the lookout finally saw it. He picked up the phone and said 3 words. Iceberg, right ahead. The crew tried to turn. The ship was too big and going too fast. It struck the iceberg at 23:40 ship's time and sank 2 hours and 40 minutes later. Let me walk you through those final 2 hours and 40 minutes. 11:40 at night. The iceberg hit. Most passengers felt almost nothing. A small shudder. Some people sleeping in their cabins did not even wake up. The damage underneath the water was a different story. The collision produced a series of thin gashes and buckled the steel plates along the starboard side, opening up compartments to flooding. The ship could survive 4 compartments flooding. That night, 6 were breached. It was already over. 12:05 in the morning. The captain gives the order to uncover the lifeboats and wake the passengers. Right, 12:05 a.m., lifeboats uncovered. But here is the problem. On April 14, the very day disaster struck, a scheduled lifeboat drill had been mysteriously cancelled. No official explanation was ever given. So the crew had never actually practiced this. And the passengers had no idea where to go or what to do. 12:45 in the morning. The first lifeboat is lowered into the water. Right, 12:45 a.m., first lifeboat lowered. Most passengers did not believe the Titanic was really sinking. Many thought it had simply dropped a propeller or was running a drill. So when crew members asked people to get in the lifeboats, many refused. One millionaire on board looked at the small wooden lifeboat and said he felt safer staying on the ship. That first lifeboat had space for 65 people. It left with 28. 2:20 in the morning. The Titanic is gone. Right, 2:20 a.m., ship gone. 2 hours and 40 minutes. That was all the time anyone had. Now we need to talk about the lifeboats. Because this is the part of the story that should make you angry. The lifeboats on the Titanic could hold 1,178 people total. There were roughly 2,200 people on board. So even if every single lifeboat was completely full, more than 1,000 people were always going to be left behind. Always. No matter what happened that night. And here is the thing people do not know. The shortage of lifeboats was not because of a lack of space. The Titanic had actually been designed to carry up to 68 lifeboats. It sailed with 20. Why? Because the law only required 16. And the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, followed the law exactly. They actually had more lifeboats than required and thought that was enough. The law itself was the problem. At the time, lifeboat regulations were based on a ship's tonnage rather than how many people were actually on board. The rules had not been updated in years. Nobody had bothered. So when 1,500 people died in that freezing water that night, the law, technically, had been followed. Every rule had been met. The White Star Line was not officially blamed for the sinking because the Board of Trade feared that this would result in lawsuits that would damage the reputation of British shipping. Nobody went to prison. Nobody lost their job. The rules just quietly changed after it was all over. Now remember I told you the detail about rich and poor passengers would matter? Here it is. First-class passengers were roughly 44% more likely to survive than other passengers. That is not a coincidence. Here is why. First-class cabins were on the upper decks, close to the lifeboats. When the alarm came, those passengers just walked a short distance and got in. Third-class passengers had to navigate multiple decks and long unfamiliar hallways, while also dealing with the social rules that kept lower-class people away from upper-class spaces. And it gets worse. Before all the third-class passengers even had a chance, sailors fastened the doors and passageways leading up from that section of the ship. The reason given at the time was to keep air trapped below so the ship would float longer. Women and children in third class had lower survival rates than men in first class. Think about that for a second. The Titanic did not just sink because of an iceberg. It sank because of decisions. And the people who suffered most were the ones who had the least say in any of those decisions. Here is the part of the Titanic story that almost nobody talks about. That night there was another ship in the area. The SS Californian. It had actually stopped moving because its captain thought the ice was too dangerous to keep going at night. The Californian was close. Very close. The Titanic fired distress rockets into the sky. 8 of them. Bright white lights shooting up and exploding in the dark. The crew of the Californian saw them. They woke up the captain and told him. The captain of the Californian saw the Titanic's distress rockets and chose to ignore them. The radio operator had already turned off the ship's radio for the night. The captain went back to sleep. By the time the Californian started moving the next morning, the Titanic had been on the ocean floor for hours. Official inquiries later concluded that this inaction directly led to a greater loss of life. The ship that could have saved hundreds of people watched the distress signals and did nothing. But even in all of this, there were moments that remind you what people are capable of when everything falls apart. The band kept playing. 8 musicians on board kept playing music on the deck as the ship sank around them. Survivors say they could hear the music even from the lifeboats. They played until the very end, with the belief that the last song performed was "Nearer, My God, to Thee." None of them survived. The engineers stayed below. The men who ran the engine stayed at their posts keeping the lights on so people could see to find the lifeboats. Every single one of them went down with the ship. And then there are the small things. A man who gave his life jacket to a stranger. A woman who refused to get in a lifeboat without her husband and stayed behind. A ship's baker who survived hours in the freezing water by staying calm and keeping moving. These were not characters in a movie. These were real people making real choices in the worst possible situation. The Titanic was found in 1985. It lies at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, about 12,500 feet underwater, roughly 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland, Canada. It is still there today. And when you look at photos of the wreck, the grand staircase now just an empty space, the rooms where people slept now covered in rust and sea life, it does not feel like history. It feels recent. It feels like it should not have happened. Because it should not have. 7 ice warnings ignored. Lifeboats that could not save half the people on board. A nearby ship that watched and did nothing. A law that measured ships by weight instead of by human lives. None of this was bad luck. These were all choices made by real people sitting at real desks who decided that certain things mattered more than the lives of the people on that ship. And 1,500 people paid for those choices with their lives in 30-degree water in the middle of the North Atlantic. The Titanic is not just a ship story. It is a story about what happens when the people in charge stop asking the most basic question: what happens to the people if something goes wrong? That question still matters today. And that is why we keep coming back to the Titanic more than 100 years later. If this story hit different than the version you already knew, subscribe. Next week we are going inside another story that history got completely wrong. See you then.